The video you are about to watch is from an old woodworking magazine that I published during the years of 2003 to approximately 2006. This was a very unique magazine. It was purely video content and it was distributed on DVDs. The magazine ran for approximately 3.5 years, and then due to financial concerns, we simply had to terminate the magazine. We moved on to other things over the last roughly 15 years. However, there has been a request to resurrect this content, so I've gone through the trouble to get the equipment, the products, everything I needed in order to bring this content back to life to share with everyone. Here on this YouTube channel, we'll be putting up approximately 100 to 120 of the original stories that appeared in that magazine. The magazine was called Woodworking at Home Magazine, and it was truly one of a kind in the world. I really hope you enjoy these videos, and please tell your friends about them.
This project is one of those projects that's going to help improve the storage, organization, and utilization of the space that you have in your shop. Now, one of the areas that we can look to for more tool storage, I'm a self-confessed tool junkie, is upper cabinets along the back wall of the shop. Now, in this particular case, I wanted them deep. A standard 12-inch deep cabinet isn't going to give me very much storage. So I went with a 21-inch deep upper cabinet. Now the problem with this type of cabinet, when they get deep like this and they're high, it's hard to reach back in there and grab the tools out. It also makes it very difficult to store and organize tools and various products that you use in your woodworking shop. So we've come up with a pretty unique solution that will really maximize the volumetric space along this back wall. Now it starts out with a very simple box, and we're going to be making that out of 1/2-inch birch plywood. Now you can use the expensive finish or apple ply as it's sometimes called, or Baltic birch, or you can use the standard 1/2-inch birch plywood that you can pick up at your home center. Now to get started, we'll start ripping up the major components over here at the table saw. Along the inside bottom face of the two side panels, we need to create a 1/2-inch wide by 1/8-inch deep dado, and that will receive the bottom panel. So I've got my rip fence set a 1/2 inch over from my 1/2-inch stacked dado head cutter, and I've got it raised up 1/8 of an inch. Now we can take those cuts. As you just saw, we machined a dado to accept the bottom panel. That would just fit in there. We would put glue and attach it with some screws to reinforce that joint. The rest of the joints, such as the top and back panel to the sides and to each other, are going to be held in place with biscuits. Now I'll be using number 10 biscuits, and along each joint I want to have a minimum of 3 or 4 biscuits. So now what I'll do is I'll go through, lay out those locations for the biscuit slots, and start cutting those. After a quick dry assembly to check to make sure everything fits up good, we're ready for final assembly. And that'll begin by putting glue in each of the biscuit slots and along the edges of the pieces. Now as you can see, I'm assembling this on its side. This will be the bottom edge, and there's the dado. And I'll start out by getting the top panel in place. And now for the back panel. And now for the bottom panel. With glue already in the dado, we just drop it in place, line up the biscuits, and that one will be in position. And now we can move on to the other side. Now I'm just driving in some 1¼ inch brads to help hold everything together while we attach all of the screws. Now what I'm doing is going through and drilling and countersinking for our 1¼ inch long number 8 wood screws. Don't use drywall screws in this application. You do want a good, strong, general purpose screw so that you've got maximum holding power. At the top and bottom of the cabinet, we're going to need a couple of trimmer pieces. Now these do help to reinforce and strengthen those upper and lower panels. So you do want to use a good quality hardwood. With the material already ripped to width, we can trim it to length at the compound miter saw. The top trimmer, which really doesn't add much for structural, is there more for decorative. That just gets glued in place, and then we'll drive a couple screws up through the 1/2-inch plywood into that top piece. And to help hold it in place while we drill for the screws, we'll tack it in place with a couple of brads, and then we can drill for the screws. Now the bottom trimmer gets held to the bottom shelf with number 10 biscuits, and I'll be putting 3 of them in on this cabinet. I've already marked the locations inside the cabinet. Now I'm just going to transfer them off to the trimmer. Now this trimmer is going to actually add a lot of strength to the cabinet because it's going to help stiffen this bottom shelf, which is carrying the majority of our load. And then we'll reinforce this joint by driving in 4 number 8 by 1.25 screws. And this wraps up the construction of the basic cabinet. Now of course you can size this to fit your needs and so forth. Now what I would do is go through, sand everything up, fill all the screw holes and so forth, and I'm going for a painted finish. If you want, stain it, varnish it, whatever you want to do is fine with us. Now, when mounting this on the wall, I would recommend that you drive screws through the back panel directly into the studs on the wall. Use heavy-duty screws, maybe number 10s or number 12s, at least 3 inches long so that you're getting deep into that stud. I would also recommend attaching a cleat against the wall right at the bottom edge of the cabinet, and that would of course help support some of the load. Now we can turn our attention to the shelves inside the cabinet. Now as I mentioned, if we just put horizontal shelves in here like a standard cabinet, it's very difficult to reach up in there and get access to the materials that are in the back of the cabinet. So what we're going to be doing is installing what I'm basically going to be calling sideways drawers. There'll be trays that are supported on ball bearing slides that slide out, and then you would have sideways access to the full shelf area. You'd slide it in, and you could build these in compartments so that you could organize all your tools and keep everything stored properly. So let's turn our attention to building some of those trays now. As you can see, I've already gone through, painted up our cabinet, and mounted it on the wall. The construction of it, as you saw, is fairly straightforward. Now I'm working on the pull-out trays, and I've already got the 2 installed on this cabinet. And these will be left-hand access. You'll slide it out and access the insides from the left-hand side. The next cabinet will be right-hand access, and that'll be the one we'll be showing you next. Before we construct the trays, I'd like to point out a few items. First, the backboard, or the back panel, is going to be 3/16 shorter than the overall inside height of the cabinet. That will allow for an 1/8 inch clearance here at the bottom and a 1/16 inch clearance at the top. The width or depth, however you want to perceive that, is going to be whatever you want it to be. Make these up to fit the tools or other items that you're going to be putting in there. You'll notice that we've got a ball bearing slide on here. Now, these cabinets are 21 inches deep. I don't want the tray to pull completely out. I want it to stay 1 inch inside the cabinet. So with a 21 inch deep cabinet, I went with a 20 inch ball bearing slide. And that gets mounted to the cabinet base using a simple cleat. Up at the top here, you'll see that there's a guide. It's nothing more than 1/4 inch thick hardboard. and that's attached to the top using brads. So with that out of the way, let's go about making our box. I'll get started on the tray by cutting the back panel to size. Now this particular tray is going to be 4 3/8 of an inch deep. So I'll go ahead and rip some strips for the sides, top, and bottom. The compound miter saw makes it very easy to cut off these components to length. Now before doing any assembly, the first thing I'm going to do is put a couple of layout marks on the back panel. There will be one that's 25/32 of an inch up from the bottom, and one that's 1 7/8 of an inch. That line that's 25/32 of an inch up from the bottom edge of the back panel is the center line position for the ball bearing slide. And the way we want the slide mounted onto the back panel is we want the back panel 1/8 inch up from the bottom edge of the slide, and that gives us clearance along the bottom edge. This next layout line that's 1 7/8 of an inch up from the bottom gives us clearance for the slide itself. And it's also going to show us where the bottom edge of that shelf is going to be mounted on the back panel. Now we've got one more layout line to do, and that one will be 7/8 of an inch from the top edge coming down. Now this layout line shows me the bottom edge of where we want the top of the tray to be mounted on. Now with that layout done, we can assemble it. The top, bottom, and sides get glued and nailed to the back panel. Now I'm using 1 1/4 inch brads to help with this assembly. Now if you're going to be putting a very large load in your trays, you may want to drive in a couple of additional screws through the back panel up into the sides, top, and bottom, and that will reinforce that joint. Next, I'll install the 2 side pieces. Again, glue and brads. And finally, we can glue in the bottom panel. And of course, if you don't have a pneumatic nailer, you can drive in brads the old-fashioned way. Nothing wrong with that. As you can see, I'm marking the hole locations for mounting up our ball bearing slides. And of course, that layout mark that we put on the back panel makes this job pretty darn easy. Using a scratch awl and pressing it into the wood, and that creates this little indentation. And that makes it much more accurate when drilling the hole, because the drill bit's going to follow that indentation. Using the screws that come with your slides, go ahead and attach the hardware at this time. And that completes the construction of our tray. Now, if you want to get more utilization out of this space, you may want to add trays, perhaps dowel rod to hang things on, little shelves. There's just a wide variety of different things that we can do on this interior space. But we'll take a look at that a little bit later. Now let's go about the process of installing each of our trays. Now we're ready to start installing our trays. Now our first tray width is 4 3/8 of an inch. Now I want an 1/8 inch clearance on this edge, so I'm going to rip my guide strip to 4 1/2 inches wide. Now while I've got the tray in here, I'm going to take an aluminum shim. Now this is nothing more than 1/8 inch thick aluminum that you can buy at your home center. I'm going to slide that in along the edge. I'm also going to make a mark right at the center line point of our cleat where the ball bearing slide mounts onto. And that will give me a reference so I can pre-drill all of those holes for mounting. Now I'll take that guide, which is again 1/4 inch thick hardboard, and I'm just going to tack it to the top of the cabinet with 5/8 inch brads. Now I can go ahead and pre-drill the holes for our mounting screws. As you can see, I've drilled 4 mounting holes. Now again with that 1/8 inch thick aluminum, and of course you could make this out of wood or whatever you want. I just happen to have one. I'm going to slide everything up tight against the right side of my cabinet. Make sure everything's pushed back. And now I'll find that hole and drill up from the bottom into our mounting cleat. And I'll drive an 1.5 inch by number 8 screw up into that cleat. And that's one tray installed. Now we can move on to the next one. Now again with that 1/8 inch shim, I'm going to place it in here along the front edge just for the moment. And that establishes my spacing. I want an 1/8 inch gap between each of the trays. Now what I can do is at the top, I can measure the distance from the right edge of this back panel to the left edge of this one. And I'm going to subtract 1/16 of an inch. So in this case, it'll be 5 1/16. That'll give me a 1/16 inch gap for this tray so that there's a little bit of clearance there, but yet still maintaining that 1/8 inch gap in this area. And now we're ready to install our next tray guide. Now remember, we wanted this to be a 1/16 of an inch away from this particular tray. So I've ripped a 1/16 inch thick shim out of a hardwood. Now what I can do is slide my support against the shim and against the back of the tray that's already installed. And again with that 1/8 inch thick shim, I'll slide that between the tray that's already installed and the one that we're installing. Make sure everything's sitting flat against our guide and our shim. I'll drill, mount up my screws, and I'll repeat this process for the next 2 trays. As you get down to your last couple of trays, your arm may not fit in the opening. Just get the upper guide tacked in place out near the front where you can get at it, and then remove the next tray. These are ball bearing slides so they can be easily removed and put back in. Well, that all checks out. Now we can go ahead and apply our false fronts. For my false fronts, I'm using 1/2 inch thick birch plywood. Now I want them to be 25.5 inches tall, which will bring it up into this area, covering up the edge grain of that 1/2 inch birch plywood for the case. I also want it to overhang the side pieces. So for our width, I'll be starting on the left, working my way to the right. I'm going to go just beyond the back edge of that tray. So that'll be 4 1/8 inches. Now to help with installing these, I'm taking that 1/8 inch aluminum shim that I was using before, and I'm placing that on top of that lower trimmer piece. Now I can take my false front, carefully line it up with the left edge of the case, and I'll tack it in place with some 1 inch brads. Now I'll measure for my next one, cut that to width, install that, and move on down the line. To help with installing the next one, I'm going to take an 1/8 inch shim and place that between the two. And of course it's resting on that 1/8 inch shim at the bottom. Tack this one in place. And for the last one, we'll place our 1/8 inch shim in place, and then I'll measure to the outside edge of the case. And as you suspect, those little brads aren't going to hold the false front on. I'm going to be driving 3/4 inch screws from the inside of the cabinet to hold that false front in place. Now I'll go through and apply some putty to take care of those imperfections. Then I'll apply some knobs a coat of paint, and then we'll show you what's inside. Well, it's been a couple of weeks since completing the wall storage cabinet project, and I must say I'm thrilled with the results. I don't think I've ever been this organized and have stored this much volume of tools and products and woodworking accessories in such a small place in all my time. So we'll bring you in close and we'll show you each of the trays and what we've put inside each of these cabinets. Now, as I may have mentioned before, this system was so efficient on space, we ended up with more storage room than we originally thought we would. So these last two cabinets here really just have some various products put in there that weren't planned on. For example, we've got a circle cutting attachment for the bandsaw, some other accessories, and an HVLP gun that we've yet to use. In this cabinet, we just got a couple of router accessories thrown in there for now. We'll end up putting some more stuff in these two cabinets later on once we designate them for a specific purpose. For these next three trays, we just have a couple of open areas and we haven't really designated these yet for a specific purpose. Right now we just got some finishing materials in there and even an empty tray. Moving on, we've got some router bits in this tray. Our big plunge router, now this one is normally mounted in our router table, but right now it's up in the cabinet. Here we've got another assortment of our router bits. Here we've got my D-handled fixed base router along with the trim router that's usually up in this location. Notice all the accessories are stored in there nice and neat as well. Moving past the router section and into the drilling section, in this particular tray I've got my 3 drill motors. This being of course the cordless drill, and that just sits on a shelf resting on its battery pack. The 3/8 and 1/2 inch electric drills, I put a small clip along the back side of the tray, and I'm using the tool belt clip to simply hook these in place. To keep the cords neatly packaged up, I just took some 3-inch diameter PVC plumbing pipe, split it on the bandsaw, and that makes a nice collar where I can coil up the cords and then tuck them in here neatly. I've got a wide variety of drill bits. I myself prefer to keep my drill bits in these commercially available drill indexes because they've got all the diameters and so forth clearly marked on there so you can easily reference which drill you want. Got a wide variety of Forstner bits, sanding drums, and other drilling accessories in this particular tray, and as you can see we've got plenty of room for more. Now moving into the saw cabinet, I've got my small 4.5 inch trim saw, a very handy little tool by the way, and my saber saw, again all of the accessories stored neatly in there. Moving on to the clamp section now, we've got some of our larger spring clamps along with the edge clamps. They're in a very simple tray here. These lower clamps are just held in place with this one board here. We use some 3/8 inch dowels that were glued and drilled through and glued into the back panel. And then the spring clamps just hang on those. Here we've got our variety of miter clamps and a couple other hand clamps. Plenty of room for more clamps to go in that one. My band clamps, all neatly stored up in there, and all the little corner clips that go along with them in a nice little tray at the bottom. Here's some more of the spring clamps that we use in the shop, along with some of the C-clamps. And finally, a few of our little quick grip clamps that are very handy for some of the operations that we do here. Into the next case, I've got some of my hand planes and my rasps and so forth located in this cabinet. Some of my adhesives that I use during assembly. Now moving into the abrasives area, I've got my large random orbit sander along with its accessories and the large belt sander. The finishing sanders, I've got my detail sander, quarter sheet sander, and my smaller 5-inch random orbit sander. Now because this is the sanding center, we should have a place to store all of the sanding belts that go with these sanders, as well as some of the smaller accessories for the detail sander and the quarter sheet sander. I also cut out the tray that held all the little formed or rubber molded pieces for the detail sander and attached that inside the cabinet. I also have a swing out tray to hold my full sheet sandpaper. As I did on the other trays, I just took some 1/4 inch diameter dowel, drilled it in through the back panel, glued it in place. And that gives me a great place to hang up all of my random orbit sand pads. And because these want to curl up and move away sometimes, we made some very simple clips by just taking a piece of hardboard, drilled a 1/4 inch hole in it, and cut a slit on the end. And that serves as a great clip to help hold all those random orbit pads nice and flat. Now we're moving into some of the assembly components again. We've got the small brad nailer, or our pin nailer, a variety of our brad nail guns, along with all the different brad nail lengths that we would use on various projects, all neatly and carefully organized so that we can gain access very quickly. And finally, in our tool area, this is our last cabinet. We've got a biscuit joiner in this location, along with our biscuit assortments. Moving on to the hardware center now. As you can see, we're using those little plastic bins that you can get at various industrial supply houses, as well as at some of the home centers. And if you get some of those bins, you'll want to pick up some of these little clips that you can mount along the back panel, and then the bins hang right on top of them. Now, as you can see, we've got plenty of open space in this tray. This particular tray is getting pretty well filled up, but we know that with woodworking, you have an awful lot of different size fasteners that you use. So we've got tray after tray after tray after tray of storage for various hardware items. We really like those bins because it gives you a nice, clean, simple, effective way of organizing all those hardware items. As you can clearly see, you can get an awful lot of organized storage out of that space that would normally be wasted. It's just a matter of paying attention to volumetric space and taking advantage of what you have. Now, in this particular case, we've put an awful lot of different tools, products, and accessories that we use here in the shop up in these cabinets. Now, if your shop is a little bit cluttered, disorganized, and so forth, you may want to take a very serious look at this project. Remember that if you get your tools organized and everything's put in its proper place, you'll work more efficiently. So that means you get more work time and less look time. Thanks for watching. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you truly enjoyed it, please help us share this information with the rest of the communities. Please hit the subscribe button, give us a big thumbs up, and be sure to tell your friends about this channel. Thanks again for watching.